Hi everybody, Playtendoguy here, and today we're going to look at the biggest game of the year so far, and arguably one of the most anticipated games of all time, The Last of Us Part 2. And before I start this review, I'm going to warn you that there's going to be story spoilers throughout this review, as I find it hard to believe that you can review this game without spoilers. So if you haven't played the game, go play it first. So with that out of the way, let's begin. Everybody remembers their first time playing The Last of Us. Naughty Dog's 2013 masterpiece was a superb swan song for the aging PS3, delivering one final knockout title before the up-and-coming release of the then new PS4. My first experience of The Last of Us was playing the remastered version a year later in 2014, and it was truly a once-in-a-generation experience. The tale of a fungal pandemic in the US and how it tore the country apart, following the viewpoint of the rugged and rather rough Joel, a smuggler who did what he did to survive in this cruel world. The original game was one massive road trip where Joel had to transport a young girl called Ellie to a group called the Fireflies. They had to fight, survive, and along the way Joel started to grow a father-daughter like bond with Ellie, which really made the game feel very special and made it one of the best stories I've ever seen in a game. Now, 7 years after the original, we're finally getting the sequel with The Last of Us Part 2. Originally revealed at the PlayStation Experience way back in 2016, the teaser trailer was easily the biggest announcement of the show. As the years have passed, we've seen glimpses of gameplay and some impressive trailers, but now, after a fair few delays, it's finally here. But was it worth the wait? First off, we're going to start talking about the story. Set a few years after the original, we follow an older Ellie as she and Joel spend their lives as residents of Jackson, a small haven away from the cruelness of the world around them. And life seems to be pretty great for Ellie. She's made a few friends and she has started to have a blossoming relationship with Dina. That's until a normal run takes a grim turn, and a military group ends up capturing and killing the much beloved Joel, leaving Ellie an emotional mess. This sets up the main plot for part 2 as it sees Ellie setting out to Seattle to find each member of this group and killing every last one of them. Coming up to the game's release, I thought this idea of a revenge storyline was a pretty interesting idea, and after completing the game, I'm kinda split on it. The game starts off strong enough with a nice recap of the original, as well as seeing how both Ellie and Joel are doing now, but for me, once they kill off Joel and the way they did it, it really did spoil the experience for me. Joel is killed by Abby, a mysterious young woman who you play for about 10 minutes during the game's opening act, which I thought was a really odd choice. Anyway, Ellie sets out to Seattle with Dina in tow, and the relationship between the pair is pretty damn good, with plenty of dialogue between the couple. And we follow the pair throughout 3 days as Ellie searches around Seattle for those who took part in Joel's killing, and the bodies certainly do mount up. And then, after 12 hours, the game dramatically pulls the rug from you and turns the tables, as then you play as Abby, the young woman who delivered the killing blow to Joel. Anyway, this part of the story follows Abby throughout the same 3 days we've just played, but we see it through Abby's side of things. We find out why she did what she did, and ultimately the game aims to humanise the character we spent the last 10 or so hours hunting for. It's an interesting way of trying to tell the story, and I can see where Naughty Dog was coming from, but frankly, Abby did nothing for me. This is where we spend a hefty amount of time now, for around another 10 to 15 hours worth of gameplay playing as Abby, and we see more of her friends who also partake in the killing of Joel. And with this section it does expand these other characters like Manny and Owen to mixed effect. Some of them are expanded enough whilst others are just there, with no more depth than what they were when we first saw them taking part in the killing of Joel. Abby's section for me should have been about a 5 hour sort of long section, but this part feels really bloated with far too many flashbacks to Abby's past with Owen, and there's a love triangle and it just feels very melodramatic and it really didn't need to be here. Thankfully the Abby section does improve in a final day and a half as we're introduced to Yara and her brother Lev. This brother and sister does bring a fair bit of charm to the game, and I even argue that they're probably the best characters in the game. Seattle eventually becomes a bloodbath for both Ellie and Abby as they eventually meet up in a brutal encounter, and after that Abby spares both Dina and Ellie, and we pick up a year later with Dina and Ellie seemingly living a perfect life. But Joel's death and her actions in Seattle has left Ellie with some sort of PTSD, and when she finds out Abby has been located, she sets out to end this once and for all. Now I quite like this part set a year after, seeing quite a peaceful life for the couple, but then it takes a bombastic and over-the-top action-packed finale that sees Ellie essentially going full Rambo, killing hordes of this new group called Rattlers to find where Abby has been captured. She eventually reaches Abby and saves her, only to fight her to the death, and ultimately she can't do it and lets her go. Ellie eventually returns home to find Dean is left and she's lost everything, ultimately leaving you asking the question, was it worth it? For me, the story was good. Certainly a cut above most AAA games, and it did have plenty of great emotional moments. And for me, it just lacked the heart that the original had. And it does show that heart occasionally with flashbacks to Joel and the inclusion of Yara and Lev. But the biggest problem here is that it feels like there's a lot of filler to the story, and it could have done with losing a fair bit of bloat that included the Abbey chapters and the game's final act. I respect the decision on how they've chosen to do the story, but for me, it's really not the road I would have gone down. But enough about the story. I could talk about that all day on what I did and didn't like about it, but it's time to move on to the gameplay now, and this is really impressive stuff. The original was a very fun playing game, but for me it suffered from the typical finding ledges, ladders and giving boost to allies, which kinda did spoil the progression a little bit. But The Last of Us Part 2 has changed the gameplay quite a bit from the original. You still have to find the occasional item to help you get up to a higher area and give boosts, but they're far less frequent here. One thing I'd like to say is don't go expecting the game to be open world, as it isn't, because bar a fairly big open area in one of the game's opening chapters, the rest is still a rather linear experience as you still have to follow one main route. Though the areas you are in are much bigger than the previous games, with more places and hidden areas to explore. As I said before, during the game's opening hours, there is an open area. Naughty Dog has experimented with it in the past with Uncharted 4 and Lost Legacy, and they did it quite well. But with Part 2, we easily have the biggest open area Naughty Dog has created to date. In this part, we follow Eddie and Dean as they explore downtown Seattle on horseback, and the main aim is to gain access to this locked gate. To do this, you have to explore a couple of buildings to get what you need to move the story forward, but there's actually about 10 different buildings you can explore, and you can tackle this level however you like. It is a shame that this is the only level that goes fully open like this, but I guess a full open game would probably be a bit too much for the PS4, but it's something we might see in a future PS5 Naughty Dog title. Once you've completed the open area chapter, the game then follows a more linear structured approach, but as said before, the areas are still pretty big with plenty of buildings and secrets and locked areas to find. Exploration is still a big part of the game as there's plenty of different collectibles you can nab. There's around 200 odds and sods you can find, and many of them are cleverly hidden. Both Ellie and Abby are also far more agile than Joel was in the original game. They can run fast, and actually there's a jump button now which allows for much more elaborate exploration and more tense combat encounters. Talking about combat, and this is where we've seen a huge improvement over the original, allowing for much more freedom on how you tackle enemy encounters. You can take each counter either stealth-like or a more loud approach. Stealth feels great, reminded me a bit of Metal Gear Solid as you're crawling on the ground trying to pick off enemies one by one. If you get discovered, then it's time to bring out the guns, and shooting certainly feels a bit floaty like it did in the original, and this is done to allow for the game to feel a bit more realistic. But once you get the hang of it, shooting is great, and you certainly feel the impact of some weapons, certainly like the shotgun, which can absolutely devastate enemies at close range. There's also pieces of wood or knives you can pick up for hand-to-hand combat, and this is by far the most satisfying way of dispatching enemies, as the impact on enemies is very crunchy and brutal. The game's many different combat encounters do change up quite a bit throughout the game. Starting off, you're going up against a fair few infected, but then the troops of the WLF are introduced, and there's also a couple of other factions introduced a fair way into the game. Enemies also are rather clever hunting you, as they also have dogs which can hunt you down. They can also hear your footsteps from far away. Getting into combat encounters with two different factions and setting them off between each other is also very satisfying, though alas there's only very few of these and they kinda do feel a bit scripted. Another nice touch is the enemies call out their names of a fellow member if you kill them. Say something like, "Oh no, Tim's dead." It's a simple little feature, but it does feel like you're killing an actual character rather than a nameless goon. Like with the original, there's an upgrade tree here that can improve both Ellie's and Abby's with new ability and skills. You explore around environments to find these manuals that give you abilities to learn these skills, but to gain these skills you have to find drugs throughout the areas. Yes, supplements, little tablet-like things, they're hidden all over the place, but to gain all the skills you'll probably have to play through the game on New Game Plus. Your weapons are also upgradable, and you can do this by collecting scraps and upgrading your weapons on the special weapon table. These upgrades do change your weapon and do help improve accuracy and increase ammo in the clip, and when you choose an upgrade you do get a lavishly detailed cutscene of either Ellie or Abby improving their gun, and it is very impressive to watch. Again, like the original, crafting is a main part of the gameplay, as your bandages, molotovs and even some ammo can only be gained by scavenging for resources. Picking what to create can be a hard choice on harder difficulties, as if you pick up an explosive you're highly likely to lose out on a chance to create some bandages. There seems to be a greater amount of resources this time around, and bar only a few times I was actually really quite comfortable enough and didn't really run out of too much on the normal difficulty. Lengthwise now, and The Last of Us Part 2 is easily the biggest game Naughty Dog has created to date, and this shows in the game's length. It took me a good 25 hours to reach the game's conclusion. It's certainly a good 10 or so hours longer than the original 12 to 15, and for me the game felt like it was a good 5 to 8 hours longer than it needed to be. Don't get me wrong, I did enjoy very much most of my time with the game. It's an exceptional game, but I was ready for the game to end about 15 or so hours in. For me, the original's 12 to 15 hours felt like it told a much more better, more structured story and didn't really have anything that felt like filler. Whilst in part 2, some of the Seattle bits did drag on a fair bit, especially in Abby's section. To 100% the game, you're probably looking at a good 40 to 50 hours depending on how many collectibles you nab during your first playthrough. There is, as I said, a New Game Plus mode which brings all your collectibles, skills, upgrades and weapons over to a new save. But there's no multiplayer fractions mode this time, and I must admit it is a shame it isn't here, as it was a surprisingly enjoyable multiplayer mode at a time when every single player game had one, and most of them were pretty rubbish. But apparently Naughty Dog is working on some sort of new sort of fractions mode, but I think it's going to be a free to play game, probably launching on the PlayStation 5. On to the presentation now, and you can tell from all this footage I've shown you already that the game is absolutely drop dead gorgeous. It's easily the best looking PS4 game out there, and it shows how far the games have come since the PS4 launched all the way back in 2013, where most of the games during the early days were just up-res PS3 games, showcasing how far Naughty Dog themselves have also come from their first PS4 game, the fantastic remaster of the original Last of Us. It is a huge step up from their last game, Uncharted Lost Legacy, which was a very impressive looking title. The Last of Us Part 2 is without shadow of a doubt the best looking console game and PS4 game to date. Environments are incredibly detailed, showcasing how the pandemic has took over Seattle, with buildings crumbling and decaying items. There's also a huge amount of foliage in areas, it's so impressive. Character models are the best in the business, with impeccably details from sweat to facial animations. It does feel at times like you're actually watching a movie. As it's a first party PS4 title, it shouldn't come as no surprise that the game runs and performs pretty much perfectly. On the base PS4 it's 1080p at 30fps, and it pretty much sticks to that 30fps with hardly a drop in sight. Whilst on the Pro we're seeing a boost to resolution of 1440p at 30fps. And again, like the base system, it sticks to that 30 FPS cap all the time, only dropping ever so slightly when in watery areas, but it's such a small drop you won't even notice it. Audio now, unlike the original Last of Us, music is a huge and very important part of the game. Not only does it give you a stellar soundtrack, but also adds to what makes the series so special. And part 2 is no different, bringing back the same brilliant musician and composer from the original to do the soundtrack, and we have yet another hauntingly beautiful soundtrack that's just as good as the original. We also have a fun little mini game in the game that actually allows you to play an in-game guitar, allowing you to strum specific chords, and if you look on YouTube you can find some very good covers of many popular songs. Voice acting is also fantastic, and it is also, that shouldn't come as no surprise, Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson give another brilliant performance as Joe and Ellie. And Ashley Johnson also deserves a special mention for her brilliantly sober rendition of a-ha's 80s classic Take On Me, which for me was one of the best moments of the game. Conclusion time now, and finally, after all these years, The Last of Us Part 2 is finally here, and for the most part, it's certainly worth the wait. It's a technical tour de force that's easily the best looking console title out there, with outstanding production values and a wonderful looking environments. Its exploration and combat is second to none, with some brutal and incredibly fun combat encounters, great enemy designs and some of the most detailed locations I've ever seen. It's just a shame that the game is just too long, as the story suffers from some bloat and some rather boring characters, but to write off the game due to its story is just daft, as bar that it's a highly accomplished title that makes me excited to see what Naughty Dog does next. It's without shadow of a doubt the best looking, best playing, best sounding game on the PS4, and a pretty fine way to end such a successful and varied era for Sony. Just a shame about the story, but with that, I'm giving Last of Us Part 2 a 9 out of 10 with the title of brilliant. As always, like, rate and subscribe, and until next time, happy gaming. Bye.